Cardiff Part 2.
Yes, sir, or might even be Part 3. So yes, the first part of today is to conclude the presentation on Cardiff and Professor Bloom. I had last week gone through all the documents that I wanted to present in open session. There were two areas I wanted to deal with this morning. The first is just to point to some of the issues and questions that emerge from looking at the evidence from some individuals in relation to Professor Bloom's practices, and then to look at his litigation report. Not all of it, it's very lengthy, but just a handful of aspects, and to raise some questions in relation to that. But before I do so, one of the themes that emerged from the documents that we looked at in relation to Cardiff and Professor Bloom last week was the interrelationship between Professor Bloom and various pharmaceutical companies and representatives of pharmaceutical companies. One of the observations or questions I posed was the extent to which Professor Bloom's views may have impacted upon what was being thought or said or done by pharmaceutical companies, and that might have had wider ramifications. It's been observed to me by a core participant that, of course, it could also have been the other way round, and information being provided or views being expressed by pharmaceutical companies could have influenced Professor Bloom's views and his articulation of those views then more widely to government and others, which of course is entirely possible because we have only the correspondence that records usually a visit has taken place, rather than having the detail of what was discussed and what views were shared during those visits. So it was a useful observation from a core participant that I wanted to pass on to you, sir. So turning then to some of the thematic issues that emerged from evidence received from patients who were treated by Professor Bloom, or the relatives of patients who were treated by Professor Bloom. I'm only going to refer to a handful of statements, and the statements I refer to and the evidence I refer to is all from those who gave oral evidence last year. The reason for that is because that is material that's in the public domain, that's been disclosed, that many people have heard. There are, of course, a number of other witness statements relevant to treatment in Cardiff, which the inquiry has, which you, sir, have read and are considering, but which aren't yet public and haven't gone through the necessary process of redaction or anonymisation. So I won't be referring to those, but I didn't want anyone in the position of having provided a statement to the inquiry to think that they are of any less importance. They are not. So one of the first witnesses you heard from in Cardiff last year was Mr. Gerald Stone, and there were a handful of core points emerging from his evidence, which you may wish to consider when you look at the evidence relating to Professor Bloom and practices at Cardiff more widely. Mr. Stone's evidence told us that he was on a home treatment programme from the beginning of 1976 onwards, in relation to his haemophilia B, and that for most of that time he was treated with British factor IX, save that there then came a period in 1985 onwards when he received, for a few months, a commercial heat-treated product, Profil 9. His evidence was that although he had some awareness of hepatitis B, he was not told by Professor Bloom or anyone else involved in his care at Cardiff of any risks relating to the receipt of factor concentrates. He had a recollection of there being a group meeting at Cardiff to which all patients were invited in the lecture theatre, in which Professor Bloom addressed the patients about what was known about AIDS. His evidence in relation to his own diagnosis of hepatitis C was that records showed he was tested without being told for hepatitis C in 1990 again in 1991, that in 1992 his general practitioner was told of the positive hepatitis C result, but Mr. Stone, the patient, was not. There are records that document again in September 1992 the hepatitis C positive result, but his evidence was that he was not told until July 1993. So there are a number of thematic issues there which then impact more widely, Sarah, upon your consideration of policies and practices at the Cardiff Haemophilia Centre under Professor Bloom. Similar themes emerged from the evidence of Susan Sparks, who told us about her late husband Les, also a haemophilia B sufferer, also mostly treated with British factor 9, although on one occasion profil 9. Her evidence too was that they were not told about any risks arising from this treatment. Her evidence was that they were asked by Professor Bloom in September of 1985, which may strike you, Sarah, as being relatively late, to come to a meeting at which Les was told that he had tested for the antibodies to HIV or HTLV3. There were entries in the medical records relating to Les from April of 1983, which referred to some form of screening for AIDS and being seen for an AIDS study. And so you will no doubt wish to consider more broadly what that might indicate about Professor Bloom's knowledge at that time, and also whether consideration was being given to patient symptomatology without patients being given any information. Her evidence was that it was in February 1985, or that the record suggested it was in February 1985, that a test for HTLV3 was undertaken. There appears to be some evidence of a test again in July 1985, but that there was some delay in the diagnosis being communicated to them. You heard, sir, from Mr. A.E., a haemophilia A sufferer. His evidence, too, was that he was not given information or advice or warnings about the risks of infection from the factor concentrate treatment that he was receiving at Cardiff. And again, this is a theme that you have heard about more widely, sir. When he was told of that he was HIV positive, he had not been aware that he was being tested. You may recall too, sir, the evidence you heard in relation to Paul Summers from his father and his widow, Michael and Monica. Their evidence was that he received no advice or information about any risks. The evidence was that he was on some form of prophylactic therapy from 1979. And you may recall too, sir, there were some periods of gaps when he wasn't treated and then was treated again for the first time in some 20 months or so with factor 8. There was, sir, the particular entry in his medical records from April 1983, and the significance of that date will not escape anyone because of the timing of the first patient, the Cardiff patient under Professor Bloom's care, believed to have AIDS. In April of 1983, Paul's records contained an entry, patient has had the same batch number as, name redacted, but for various reasons, which I won't go into in terms of various records that the inquiry has had access to in terms of individual patient records, the redacted name is likely to be the Cardiff patient. So some form of recognition in April 1983 that those who had received that particular batch may need particular consideration. The evidence further was that in September of 1985, so again, that date appears to have some significance in terms of testing, Professor Bloom told the family GP of Paul's diagnosis, but didn't tell him as patient, and he was not aware that he was being tested for HTLV3. And the evidence, you will recall, sir, was that he was never given that information by Professor Bloom or the Cardiff Haemophilia Centre, but discovered it when he was seen by a doctor in Plymouth, where he was then studying. You heard evidence from Mr. A.F., who spoke about himself and his late brother, both infected with HIV. Mr. A.F. described being treated with cryoprecipitate for a number of years before the treatment changed to factor VIII concentrates. No warning or advice given. His evidence was that if he had been told of the risks of serious illness or disease, he would have chosen to stay on cryoprecipitate. His records show he received a range of different commercial factor VIII products. His records record in May of 1983, again, April, May seemed to be significant in relation to Cardiff in that respect, bloods taken for AIDS. He was not told that. When he was given his diagnosis, he was not aware that he had been tested. You heard evidence from Gaynor Lewis, widow of the late Hayden Lewis. He had been treated with cryoprecipitate and fresh frozen plasma before moving in the early 1970s onto treatment with factor concentrates. He went on to a home treatment program in or around the late 1970s. And in the 70s and 1980s received a range of different factor VIII products, including a range of different commercial products over the years. The evidence there too was that he had not been given any information or advice or warnings about any risks of viral infection as a result of the treatment. He had not been privy to any discussion with Professor Bloom about the different treatments or why treatments were being changed. When in 1985 he was told he was HIV positive, he did not know he had been tested. The records in relation to hepatitis C suggested that he may have been tested in 1991, but that it may not have been discussed with him until 1993. He had, as reported by his wife to you, sir, some recollection of being told that in the 70s that he might get jaundice, but the evidence suggested that the risk in relation to that had been underplayed. And you also heard from Hayden and Gareth's sister about Gareth Lewis. She related how factor VIII had been effectively described to them as a wonder drug, and her evidence or her understanding was that Gareth had not been given advice or warnings or information about risks. The last patient wanted to talk about in terms of the oral evidence that you heard, sir, is Colin Smith. and you heard evidence from his parents, Janet and Colin. And just to remind you, because the dates here really, you may think, Sarah, are really very telling indeed. Colin was born in 1982. He was seen by Professor Bloom on the 21st of July, 1983. And the notes record he was a known haemophiliac, not treated, never given 8 concentrate or cryo. The next day, the 22nd of July, Colin was given factor VIII concentrate for the first time. That was Lister factor VIII, so NHS product. You may recall, sir, there was a letter in Colin's records from Professor Bloom to the general practitioner, which said all these materials carry the risk of hepatitis, particularly non-A, non-B, but this is something haemophiliacs have to accept. And you may wish to reflect, sir, on that phraseology when you consider not just Cardiff, but haemophilia clinicians' decisions and actions more widely. Colin's parents' evidence were that they were not told of the risk of non-A, non-B hepatitis, nor were they told of any risk of AIDS. And that is why the timing of Colin's treatment is perhaps particularly significant. I should add that not long after that first treatment, which was with Lister factor VIII, he was treated with commercial products. Cryobulin in August of 1983. He then received Elstree product again. He was then treated with an Armour product, Elstree again. He also at some stage received cryoprecipitate. Now the timing of that perhaps assumes particular significance when we look at what was known or should have been known about the risk of AIDS in the first half of 1983. I'm not going to put back on screen a whole host of documents, but just to remind those who may not have heard all of the evidence thus far of 4 key documents from the first half of 1983. The first, which I won't put up, which we looked at yesterday with Dr. Colvin, but which he did not remember, is the meeting at the Excelsior Airport, the Excelsior Hotel, Heathrow Airport, on the 24th of January 1983. Thanks to the note taken by Dr. Frank Bolton, at least we think it's by Dr. Frank Bolton, of that meeting, we know that in the afternoon session of that meeting, at which a number of haemophilia clinicians attended with representatives of Immuno and others, including Professor Bloom, who chaired the meeting, there was a detailed discussion of the current position in terms of cases of AIDS, reference to the New England Journal report from January 1983, discussion of the numbers being reported from the United States. So as at the 24th of January 1983, all those attending that meeting, including Professor Bloom, had that information. We then move on in the course of 1983, and a whole host of relevant materials, but move on perhaps to the Galbraith letter of the 9th of May 1983. Henry, I gave you the reference before we started, and I haven't written it down. It's the CBLA reference that I think you wrote down. Although we looked at it yesterday with Dr. Colvin, we didn't look at it during the Cardiff presentation, and that's why I'm going to put it up on the screen again, because there may be those who were watching the Cardiff presentation previously who did not, who have not seen this letter. So here we are, 9th of May 1983. This is 2.5 months before Colin was treated by Professor Bloom for the first time. It's the letter from Dr. Spence Galbraith, to the Department of Health, setting out the following very clearly. Last week, whilst you were away in Geneva, a case of AIDS in a haemophiliac in Cardiff, so a patient under Professor Bloom's care, who had received USA Factor VIII concentrate was reported. The case fits the recognised criteria for the diagnosis of AIDS. In the Lancet of the 30th of April, 3 cases in haemophiliacs in Spain are reported. I confirm that they received USA Factor VIII concentrate. In the same issue of the Lancet, the tally of 11 reported cases in haemophiliacs in the USA is recorded, and a paper describes a case in a multiply transfused child in the USA. Now, this was not a letter addressed to Professor Bloom. I cannot, without checking, recall whether we have evidence as to whether he saw it, and if so, when. But the information that's reported there is all information that would have been known to Professor Bloom. Obviously, the position of his own patient in Cardiff would have been known to him by this time. And you may think it's fair to infer that he would have been aware of what was being reported in the Lancet. And if we then go to the second page, please, Henry. Again, this is for the benefit of any who were not at the inquiry hearing yesterday when we went through this. This is what is being said by Dr. Spence Galbraith in early April 1983. The AIDS epidemic is probably due to a transmissible agent. The agent is probably transmitted by blood and blood products. If we go further down, we can see there's expressed reference to Professor Bloom's case in Cardiff, fitting the accepted criteria of AIDS and having received US Factor VIII concentrate. We see him saying in point 3, although the number of cases is very small, this may not indicate that the risk is small, and he goes on to explain why. If we go over the page, please, Henry. We see at 4, he says, Factor VIII concentrate and pool products would appear to have a high risk of being contaminated with AIDS agent, and he explains why. He explains at paragraph 5 that there's no means of ensuring that blood or blood products are free of the AIDS agent at that point in time. And then at 6, the mortality rate of AIDS exceeds 60% 1 year after diagnosis and is expected to reach 70%.
As I understood Dr. Colvin's evidence yesterday, even though he was not a reference centre director himself at the time, he accepted that all those points corresponded with his then knowledge.
Yes, absolutely. And that the points being made by Dr. Spence Galbraith here were effectively agreed. Again, so it'll ultimately be a matter for your judgment, but if a doctor such as Dr. Colvin, not then a reference centre director, is able to confirm his knowledge of these matters, it would seem inconceivable that Professor Bloom, as chair of UKHCDO and a leading reference centre director and privy to information that others did not have, would not have equally have been aware of these points.
Well, the inference is available to me that someone reported the case from Cardiff to the centre. That report must have been made before the 9th of May. One would expect 2 or 3 days beforehand. It was plainly a report which was understood as referring to a case of AIDS as such. And it seems inconceivable, or it may be said to be inconceivable, I listened to any submissions the other way, that Bloom didn't know about it.
Precisely so, sir. And of course, we have other material that refers to the Cardiff case, which is earlier than the 9th of May.
And part of the significance of that might be that at a later meeting of the UKHCDO, you showed me earlier, there was some concern about the fact that a case in Bristol had gone unnoticed because it hadn't been reported, and it was emphasised how important it was to report cases.
To Dr. Galbraith, yes.
So Cardiff was ahead of the game in reporting.
That was the 9th of May, sir. Could we then go back to a document that we did look at when last week in the Cardiff presentation? But again, just to see the timing, WITN 4029002, please. WITN 4029002. I may have written that down incorrectly. That's it. So, again, so you will see the date. This is one of two sets of Cardiff guidelines provided to the inquiry by Professor Collins, who is the current director at Cardiff. This is from May of 1983, and so it's internal as far as we understand this document to Cardiff. And you'll see what's set out there in relation to children with severe haemophilia. Use cryo or NHS factor 8. As in 1B above. So the first port of call in terms of treatment for a child with severe haemophilia under Cardiff's own May 83 guidelines was cryoprecipitate. If that couldn't be used for some reason, then NHS factor 8. And we then move from May 1983 to the following month, the 24th of June, and we'll just go back to a letter we've looked at on a number of occasions, sir. HCDO 000270_004. This is, of course, the letter co-authored by Professor Bloom of the 24th of June 1983. It follows the Hemophilia Reference Centre Director's special meeting in May. And again, we can see the advice in relation to children set out at 2 for treatment of children and mildly affected patients or patients unexposed to imported concentrates. And of course, Colin was both a child and a patient unexposed to imported concentrates. Many directors already reserve supplies of NHS concentrates, cryoprecipitate or freeze-dried, and it would be circumspect to continue this policy. That's the advice being given more broadly, and we know from the Cardiff document we've just looked at, that was Cardiff's own policy was cryoprecipitate first, then NHS factor 8. So that's the 24th of June. That's just under 4 weeks before Colin was treated by Professor Bloom with factor concentrates. Initially NHS and then commercial. The final document I wanted to look at, again, just to juxtapose what's known more broadly with what's being done in relation to treatment within Cardiff itself, is a document we've also looked at before, NHBT 0020668, please. Have I given you the wrong reference, Henry? That's it. Thank you. So this is the month of July. It's before the date when Colin was seen. It's the 6th of July, 1983. This is the National Blood Transfusion Service letter. But if we go to the second page and go down towards the bottom of the page, we can see the question, can AIDS be transmitted by transfusion of blood and blood products? And the answer, almost certainly yes. That is the information that the transfusion service proposed to provide to donors. The evidence of Colin and Janet Smith was that they were not, as the parent of a child, a baby about to be treated, they were not told anything about the risk of AIDS. that is from the short summary I've given, as I say, which is just a snapshot of some of the evidence from Cardiff, which in turn is a snapshot of the much wider evidence you've heard and read from haemophilia centre patients across the country. The evidence of not being told of the risk of AIDS is a very common feature of that evidence. The timing is obviously particularly telling in the particular case we've been looking at, because this is a child about to be treated for the very first time. Lastly, in relation to that case, the evidence was that they were told Colin's diagnosis. He was by then 2.5 in a corridor, and that they had not known he was being tested for HTLV3. So that, as I say, is just a summary of, by way of snapshot, of some of the evidence relating to Professor Bloom's treatment of patients, which you will no doubt wish then to fit into the broader picture as revealed by the documentation, some of which we looked at last week.
Well, what I have to resolve is it whether there was a mismatch between what he was doing and what he should have known, or by inference must have known, and what he was saying, both publicly to the Hemophilia Society and others, and less publicly, as minuted in the October, for instance, minutes of the HCDO.
Yes.
When he appears to be saying to fellow directors that there's absolutely no proof that blood transmits AIDS.
Yes, I think absolutely, sir, is your own addition of an adverb, but certainly the minutes record him saying no proof in October 1983 in response to the point being expressly raised about reversion to cryoprecipitate by Dr. Chisholm, as you'll recall.
Yes.
So there are then just a handful of matters I wanted to draw attention to. They mostly relate to the large lengthy litigation report that Professor Bloom prepared. Before we look at that, there's just one matter I wanted to raise, which I made some reference to last week when we were looking at the Cardiff and Bloom documents. You will recall the early May Haemophilia Society statement, the one sheet, I think dated the 4th of May, where we know sent to all Haemophilia Society members, where Professor Bloom had provided information and advice. And you may recall, sir, the issue of what was known or may have been known about cases emerging in Germany is an issue which arises from that document. We know from other material prepared for a Council of Europe meeting in May, that by the end of April, it was known, certainly to those preparing the Council of Europe Committee's report, that 2 cases had occurred in Germany. We don't know, and currently our investigations have not provided any further information about this. We don't know whether that was material he would have known or been sent in advance of the early May 1983 Haemophilia Society statement. We do know that the following month, in June, Dr. Gunson reported to the CBLA an update on AIDS, in which his report referred to the 2 suspected of cases in Germany. And it seems likely, from all the documentation we've seen, that is something that would, by then, late June, have come to Professor Bloom's attention, at least by that route, the route of Dr. Gunson's report, if not by then, through a range of possible other routes. You will recall, sir, from the presentation last week that in July, the Hemophilia Society invited Professor Bloom to consider whether he wanted to update his statement. He didn't take that opportunity. And so whilst, therefore, his original May statement may have correctly recorded his then state of knowledge, no cases in Germany, an inference that may be open to you to draw from the documentation, sir, is that he failed to correct that when given the opportunity to do so in July of 1983, by which time it seems likely he would have had that information. So then Professor Bloom's litigation report, as can be seen, this is just the report and not the appendices. It was a lengthy document. Could we just have it on screen, please, Henry? It's DHSC 0001297. You can see there the date of it, sir, June 1990. It was prepared for the then ongoing litigation. You will want to consider it, no doubt, sir, in some considerable detail. I'm just going to alight upon a handful of points by way of illustration and drawing attention to some matters that you are likely to want to consider further. If we could go, please, Henry, to... It's the numbered page 45, but it might be page 48 on the version you have, Henry. Yes. So you will see here, sir, under the heading non-A, non-B hepatitis, if we go down the page, this is what Professor Bloom says in his expert report. The risk that non-A, non-B hepatitis progresses to chronic hepatitis was known in 1977, but the full significance of the information in, and we can look at the subparagraphs if necessary, but it's about the progression and seriousness of the condition above, was not fully appreciated during the 1970s and developed mainly during the 1980s. Now, you will no doubt wish to consider whether that is an assertion that you accept, or whether, in light of some of the material that we've been exploring over the last few weeks, you ultimately reach the conclusion that there should have been, in the second half of the 70s, that knowledge. If we go on, please, to page 56, so it's probably 59, Henry, in the document you have. We see Professor Bloom continues at the top of the page by saying this: by 1980, most haemophilia specialists recognised the risk of hepatitis in haemophiliacs after treatment with concentrates. Again, you'll wish to consider whether that is you accept that as a date, or whether you consider there's an earlier date by which that was recognised or should have been recognised. The general recommendation, however, was that bleeding was still the main cause of morbidity and mortality, and that treatment with concentrates should continue. And then he says this: except perhaps that treatment with cryoprecipitate may have been more circumspect in general in young children, and that DDAVP should be used within its constraints in mildly affected patients with haemophilia A. So there appears to be a recognition there from Professor Bloom that by 1980, cryoprecipitate should perhaps have been being considered for young children and DDAVP for mild haemophiliacs rather than concentrates. And again, you'll wish to consider both whether you accept that, whether you think it's something that should have been or could have been done earlier, and whether there is any mismatch between what's said here to be a general recommendation and what was actually being done in haemophilia centres. If we turn to page 71, internal pagination, so page 74, Henry, for you. You'll see here a section headed General Availability of Information to Patients. And it said this, and of course this was a commentary or a report provided for the purposes of defending litigation. Individual plaintiffs may take up the question of information given to them concerning the possibility that blood and blood products may transmit hepatitis or other viruses. Here I comment briefly on general information with regard to hepatitis. And you'll see that he refers to manufacturers' inserts. And at some stage, sir, during hearings over the coming months, we will try and set out and show what we have by way of manufacturers' inserts and what it says over the years. Representatives of the Hemophilia Society were regularly present at HCD meetings at which hepatitis was always discussed. Reference to hepatitis was included in the book Living with Haemophilia by Dr. Peter Jones, a book intended for patients and relatives and published in 1974. So it may be said that here is Professor Bloom saying, well, patients could find out about the risk of hepatitis from other sources. Doesn't address here the question of what could or should have been provided by doctors to their patients. And you may think, sir, that would be expected to be the first port of call for any patient receiving treatment, would be to be given information by their doctor. You'll look, as I say, in due course, sir, at what the inserts say, and whether the reference to representatives of the Hemophilia Society being present at Hemophilia Centre director meetings is effectively suggesting, to some extent, that the responsibility for passing on information was somehow devolved to the Haemophilia Society. We will look at an appropriate stage at what was actually said in Dr. Jones's book on the subject of hepatitis. But you only need to look at the dates, 1974, to know that after 1974, very soon after 1974, knowledge of non-A, non-B hepatitis and its potential consequences was being considered and published in in the documents and journals that we've looked at, 74, 75, 76. So that which is set out in a book in 1974 may not be the most reliable guide to what was known by 1976, 1977, or 1978, for example, when Professor Preston's study was published in The Lancet.
1974 is only a year after concentrates became licensed for general distribution in the UK if they were imported, was it not?
Yes.
So there would have been at most a year's experience of commercial concentrates, and at that stage, although I think the precise figures are yet to be given to me, it may well be that NHS concentrate was made from much smaller pools than later was the case.
Yes, and obviously the question of pool sizes at particular points in time and how they changed is a very important question for you to consider.
Yes.
But in any event, that's what's said by Professor Bloom to be potential other sources of information, but doesn't address what information would have been given as a standard or good practice to patients by clinicians. If we then just turn on to page 87, probably your page 90. You'll see here, this is, and I'm, as I say, sorry, I'm just alighting on certain passages. The report obviously needs to be read and considered in full. But this is part of a chronology provided by Professor Bloom about developing knowledge in relation to AIDS. And he refers there in September 1982 to the publication from the Centres for Disease Control, the MMWR. And what he then says by way of comment is, until September, most of the information on AIDS and haemophilia had been published in MMWR, a periodical not read by or available to haematologists or haemophilia doctors in UK. Now, the question of what was read by individual clinicians is perhaps a question that can only be answered by individual clinicians. And you have, I think, thus far been told by Dr. Winter that he did read them and by Dr. Colvin that he didn't. The suggestion that the MMWR was not available to haematologists is a broader question, which you'll no doubt wish to consider when you've heard further evidence.
Well, Dr. Winter got hold of it.
Yes.
From somewhere.
Yes. Of course, we know from documents we looked at last week that certainly the December 1982 MMWR report, that's of the San Francisco baby case, had by January 1983 been sent to Professor Bloom. We know that because we saw a reference to that happening in another document, which I showed you last week. If we go 2 pages further on, please, Henry, to internal pagination, page 89, and we go to the bottom half of the page, you will see January 1983. He refers to the editorial by Dr. Jane Deforge in the New England Journal of Medicine, which we've looked at on a number of occasions. And we know, again from other material, that it had to have come to Professor Bloom's attention because it's referred to in that 24th of January 1983 meeting at the London Airport Hotel. He refers to this and then says, by way of comment, this was a remarkably astute editorial, but it did not have a great impact. Pausing there, it was described, I think, by Dr. Winter as effectively something of a watershed moment, or words to that effect. I may not have the precise words used by Dr. Winter accurately, but that was one of the thrust of his evidence. But here is Professor Bloom saying it didn't have a great impact. A question for you, sir, maybe should it have done? What he goes on to then say is give a number of reasons for that. Partly, he says, because AIDS and haemophilia was so uncommon. And that is, again, raises the question of whether there was a proper understanding of the difference between incidence and risk. Partly because the evidence in the 2 accompanying papers was weak. And again, so you may wish to consider whether that is an assertion that you accept. Partly because of the cause of AIDS was quite unknown. And then he says this, and partly, but mainly, so this is the reason he is giving as to why it didn't have a great impact, because widespread conversion to cryoprecipitate therapy would have completely upset factor VIII production and blood transfusion practice in UK and elsewhere. Thus, diversion of plasma to production of cryoprecipitate locally would have stopped the flow of plasma to the fractionators, e.g. at Elstree. In any case, provision of cryoprecipitate locally would have meant recruitment of staff, provision of facilities, etc. locally, which were not justified from the evidence available. It would also have resulted in curtailment of home treatment and reduction of hospital treatment, for which eventuality neither doctors nor patients were ready. Now, just dealing with that last observation, the question of what patients were ready for may turn in part upon what patients knew or had been told by their doctors. But you will no doubt wish to consider that explanation with some care. If I may paraphrase it, it appears to be a desire not to upset the apple cart, he doesn't suggest that any of the steps which would have been needed in order for there to be widespread conversion to cryoprecipitate, he doesn't suggest those steps would have been impossible or even highly problematic. He just says, well, it would have been a complete upset to what was then being done and would have required arrangements to be made locally and would have had an impact upon fractionation centres.
Well, it's perfectly arguable, isn't it, that that would have been problematic, to use your word. So I'm not sure it wouldn't have been problematic.
No, sir. Whether it would have, he doesn't suggest it would have been impossible. He suggests that there may have been various steps that, as a matter of practicality, would have to have been taken, and that may be correct.
Several logistical problems.
Logistical issues, exactly. His view is that those weren't justified from the available evidence, and that is a core question that you'll need to consider, sir. If we then come on to page 95, so 98 for you, Henry, we can see in July of 1983, he says CDSC reports on AIDS commence. That's the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre. That's not strictly accurate from what we've seen, sir, because there is, of course, the May 1983 CDSC report, which I think it was Mr. Stone who referred to that first of all in his evidence last year in Cardiff, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, which was from early May, and which reported the Cardiff patient, Professor Bloom's own patient. If we go on then to page 98 of the internal pagination. We can see at the top of the page, November 1983, he says the first AIDS case in the UK was reported in the literature. That is, I think, a reference to Dr. Helena Daly's report of the Bristol case. But of course, we know whatever was or wasn't reported in the medical literature, what had been reported widely by then in material available to haemophilia clinicians was the Cardiff case, much earlier in the year. And then if we go over the page, please, to Professor Bloom's comment, you will see he says this: by the end of 1983, there was much epidemiological and circumstantial evidence to suggest that AIDS was transmitted by a hitherto unknown virus, but proof of this was lacking. So again, that use of the word proof. As far as severe haemophilia was concerned, most authorities recommended that they should continue to use factor VIII concentrates. In the UK, this meant both imported and domestic. For children, cryoprecipitate was recommended when this was practical. For mildly affected patients, cryoprecipitate or DDAVP was recommended where appropriate, but there would obviously be exceptions for serious injury, head injury, home treatment, etc. So it would appear to be his understanding there that there were mildly affected patients on home treatment with concentrates. And then if we go over to page 103, please. You'll see there in the middle of the page his reference to his own survey of AIDS in treated European haemophiliacs, which was published in 1984, or produced by him in 1984. And again, we just see some of the terminology being used. Although it was stated that the most likely culprit was imported factor VIII concentrate, it was noted that no haemophiliac patient with AIDS definitely related to transfusion of blood products was reported from Germany. Again, that potentially a slightly puzzling reference given reports from 1983 of 2 cases in Germany. And you will wish to consider the extent to which issues such as proof or looking for something to be definitely related, whether that was shaping Professor Bloom's response and reaction, and whether that was the appropriate way in which to view the risk. If we then turn to page, I think it's 144, Henry. Yes, page 143, so 146 or 7 for me. If we go to the previous page, This is a section of Professor Bloom's report which charts the response of Haemophilia Centre directors. So it essentially records what was said, what meetings took place. This section of his report does not include a reference to the meeting, the London Airport meeting with Immuno. It is right to note that that is referred to, but not in any great detail, in a section of his report which talks about interactions with pharmaceutical companies. But its significance or potential significance and the content of the detailed discussion on AIDS is not described in the report. And again, we can see how, for example, if we look at the following page, Henry, when Professor Bloom refers 7th of March 1983 through to the letter he received from Dr. Bruce Evett at CDC. I won't go back to that letter, so we looked at it last week, but you'll recall the terms in which it was expressed, whether the urgency that seems to emerge from that letter is something that was fully recognised by Professor Bloom is going to be a matter that you will no doubt consider in due course. And then if we just turn on then to page 173, you'll see here that there's a section in the report headed Liaison with the Hemophilia Society. You may wish to consider the terms in which the second paragraph is put. It says the Haemophilia Society has a medical advisory panel presently consisting, so that's as at 1990, of Drs. Ritzer, Tuddenham, Kernoff, Colvin, Main, Jones and me, as far as I can recall. He says it met infrequently until the last year, and that is consistent with the documents that we've seen, sir. And then he says this, until then, most direct medical advice to the Society seems to have been made on an ad hoc basis. I corresponded with Society officers at various times, but much advice was obtained, I suspect, through Dr. Peter Jones of Newcastle. Now, we'll look at a later stage at what advice Dr. Jones may or may not have been given to the Haemophilia Society, but you've seen the particularly prominent role played by Dr. Bloom, Professor Bloom, in terms of his communications with the Haemophilia Society, in particular in these critical years as far as AIDS is concerned of 1983 and 1984. And if we just turn on to page 177, you will see here, for the entry 8th of October 83, Professor Bloom's account of the Haemophilia Society meeting he attended on the 8th of October 1983. We've seen the correspondence between Professor Bloom and Mr. Waters after that meeting. I showed you that last week. I won't go back to it. But this is how Professor Bloom is recounting it. He says that he was now more circumspect than previously with regard to the role of blood products in AIDS, and suggested that until their role became more clear, it would be wise to revise dosages and for haemophiliacs to modify their lifestyle to prevent bleeding. So two issues there, two practical suggestions he says he made at that meeting. One, presumably a reduction in dosages, and secondly, lifestyle modification to avoid the need for treatment, both of which were explored with Dr. Colvin yesterday. Whether we see that advice recorded in any of the materials produced by UK-HCDO will be a matter you'll wish to consider. Whether we see that replicated in terms of the individual patient experiences under Professor Bloom is a matter you will wish to consider. But here are two measures being suggested. And then what's said by Professor Bloom is this was met with a very poor reception by the audience. Several patients or parents spoke from the floor, and the gist of the response was that they did not wish to, nor did they attend to, reduce demands for therapy using current products. And again, you may wish to compare that with how the meeting was described by Mr. Waters in his correspondence. So I'm not going to refer to any further particular extracts from the litigation report. As I say, both for the issues which you need to consider and, of course, as a matter of fairness to the late Professor Bloom, the report needs to be read in full. But by way of a handful of concluding observations in relation to Cardiff and the position of Professor Bloom, it would appear to be clear from all the material that we've looked at so far that Professor Bloom was a central and perhaps the most important figure in shaping the response of haemophilia clinicians to the risk of AIDS. By the time of its emergence, in terms of haemophiliacs being affected in 1982, he'd been chair of UKHCGA for 3 years and was already clearly a significant and influential figure. His role as chair and his role on the various committees and working groups that we looked at last week would appear to show that he received more information than other clinicians working in the field of haemophilia may have done.
Do we actually have a count of the number of committees concerned with the risks of AIDS and hepatitis upon which Professor Bloom sat during the years 1980 to 1984?
I listed a number of them at the beginning of the Cardiff presentation. We know he was on, although this appears to be a meeting in the 70s rather than the 80s, the expert group on the treatment of haemophilia and allied conditions, which was a group advising the DHSS in the 1970s. He was on the Hemophilia Society medical advisory panel from 1979 until his death in 1992. He was chair of UKHCDO from 1979 to 1985, so they had a 3-year term of office, and he served 2 terms of office in what you may think is perhaps the most critical period in terms of responding to risk. He was, as a reference centre director, attending the reference centre director meetings both before and after his chairmanship, and therefore would have received routinely the various working party reports, including Dr. Krask's various reports for the hepatitis working party. He was on the UKHCDO's AIDS group, but that didn't start until January 1985, and of course that's one of the issues you'll want to consider, whether that was too late. He was on he was a member of the CBLA, Central Blood Laboratories Authority, from 82 to 84 or 85. He was on the MRC's Working Party on AIDS between 1983 and 1987. He was a member of EGA, the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS set up by the Department of Health, but you'll recall that was not set up or didn't meet until 1985. There are then various other groups or committees in which he had some role or other. The AIDS Medical Advisory Committee to the World Haemophilia AIDS Centre, we've seen some reference to in papers. The British Society for Haematologists Working Party on AIDS. The National Blood Transfusion Service Advisory Committee Working Group on AIDS. And its technical and scientific working group on viral contamination of blood, although that might have been later in the 1980s. So we know he was one of a very a small number of experts who were asked to give their advice to the subcommittee of the Committee on Safety of Medicines in that critical July 1983 meeting, and the subcommittee's advice was then accepted by the committee. We know that he was regularly, or relatively frequently in any event, in contact with the Department of Health, not least through Dr. Wolford, Dr. Diana Wolford. There are a number of communications and correspondence with him. He was in communication with BPL and others within the National Blood Transfusion Service over the relevant period. So that's not necessarily exhaustive, but I hope is at least a partial answer to your question, sir.
Yes, thank you.
And what we appear to see from the material we've looked at so far, sir, is that within UKHCDO, he took the lead as chair, perhaps unsurprisingly, and you've already observed, sir, in relation to the October 1983 meeting, it's Professor Bloom who responded to Dr. Chisholm's suggestion. So there is a sense from the minutes of Professor Bloom shaping the debate. Outside of UKHCDO, he was often in these groups or in these discussions with the department and others, the only one or one of very few haemophilia clinicians who were being consulted. And there were a number of groups upon which we will also see the presence of Dr. Ritzer, and we'll look at that tomorrow. And of course, the relationship he had with the Hemophilia Society and the communications, whether it's the May 1983 letter or advice, his decision not to revise that in July 1983, his address in October 1983, the question and answer session we looked at as reported in the Haemophilia Society Bulletin, his advice and views would no doubt have been heard in terms of what patients were hearing, not only by his own patients, but by the wider patient community through Haemophilia Society communications. And so it's for those reasons, essentially, sir, that his role is a critical part of the analysis that you'll need to undertake, both in terms of considering the position of the patients that were treated at the Cardiff under his care, but also considering how his wider influence shaped the response of haemophilia clinicians and others more generally. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to say about Cardiff, and I think that leads neatly in terms of timing to the break.
Yes. Well, we'll take a break until, say, shall we say 20 to 12? 20 to 12.